Welcome, everyone, to this session as part of Parkinson's Awareness Week 2025. Today, we have a very special guest with us, Rory Cellan-Jones. Now, Rory has had an incredible career as a technology journalist at the BBC, where he covered some of the most groundbreaking stories in tech. But today, we're here to talk about something quite different. His heartwarming book, Sophie from Romania, A Year of Love and Hope with a Rescue Dog, and his journey with Parkinson's, as well as his podcast, Movers and Shakers, and his advocacy work, including the Parky Charter. Rory, thank you so much for joining us today.
Very excited to be here. Lots to talk about.
Lots to talk about. So let's get started with them talking a bit about Sophie. So what inspired you to write Sophie from Romania?
Well, she arrived in December 2022, just before Christmas. And I was a very practiced user of Twitter in particular, social media. So I talked about our previous dog. We had a dog called Cabbage. And I began to talk about this dog. And her story absolutely gripped people because she arrived in our house. I think we can show some pictures, actually.
That'd be lovely.
That is her. That's the very first picture, her being handed over to me at 3 a.m, December, Saturday before Christmas, and you can see how frightened she was, and she just, for the first few days, and then it extended further and further. She hid behind our sofa, and the story of this frightened little dog just completely gripped people. It was just before Christmas. It was a dark time of year, and people, there's a lot going on. The Ukraine war was started, the cost of living crisis, and people somehow latched onto this story. And everything I put up about her got thousands of people interested and talking about it. There was the DJ Nick Grimshaw tweeted something to the effect of, "I can't believe everyone isn't just following what's happening with Sophie from Romania." And I was in the middle of I was just finishing a book about my mother, a memoir I wrote called Ruskin Park. And so I was quite head down in that. And my agent called me, my literary agent, and said she'd got 5 major publishers wanting to know if I was going to write a book about Sophie. So I went kind of and thought, well, maybe I'd better. And that's how the book started.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because, you know, it's such a great thing to do, to bring a rescue dog into your home. Tell us a little bit about what the most challenging part of integrating Sophie into your home has been, Rory.
Well, I think we can flick on through a couple of this picture tells a story. That's me, age 5, on the balcony of the council block where my mum brought me up, and it's making the point that I'm not a dog person. We didn't grow up with dogs. I was quite afraid of dogs. We weren't allowed dogs when I was a child, but I got to know them. I got to love them later. If we flick on just a couple of slides, you'll see our previous dog. Yeah, there. That is Cabbage, who was a rescue dog, a British rescue dog, who was quite nervy at first, but didn't really prepare us for how scared Sophie would be. Cabbage was flighty and a bit highly strung, but always wanted to go for a walk. In fact, 3 walks a day. She was very good for me. I need a lot of exercise. It's an important thing in Parkinson's. And although, of course, Cabbage slowed down drastically in later years, she was usually a very energetic dog. So I thought Sophie would be the same. And if we shuttle on, we can see more of her. But she, there she is. That's the huge challenge. She was behind our sofa.
Oh.
She basically lived there 90% of the time. And she was no trouble. She did, luckily, after a month, learn to go out in the garden to do what a dog needs to do. But we hardly saw her. And it was a really intense period because we wanted to have a relationship with this dog, but she was just too scared of everything.
Yeah.
We had a very good guy called Cy Wooler, who lives in Scotland, northern Scotland, who was advising us, and he just told us we had to go at her pace, and it would be a very gradual business. And if we shuttle on, we can see a couple of the stages of what happened with her. I mean, there were good bits, even quite early on. I put up a little video of her taking a snack after Christmas from my hand, and I thought this is going to be fine. And then she'd disappear again. Eventually, we took her to the vet, literally 6 months on, and this was an absolutely terrifying day because she'd never been out of the house, never been to the vets before, and she was trembling all over. That's my wife holding her, and the vet put her on, and I couldn't believe this at the time. I thought, I can't believe we're doing this. Put her on something called fluoxetine, better known as Prozac, and she's been on Prozac ever since. And they warned us it might take 6 weeks for it to have any impact. And it was actually the 7th day of the 6th week that we saw a big change. We can continue to shuttle on through these pictures. She began to get more playful, but the big thing was she'd never been out of our sitting room into the hall. And one day my wife was at the front door, taking some rubbish out, and turned around and nearly jumped out of her skin because the dog was standing there going, hello. And she had suddenly acquired the confidence to move beyond this sort of invisible barrier that was at the door into the hall. And from then on, very slowly, things began to get better. I mean, that picture, that tells a story. That bed was one of 2 we had, which she'd never been near until this confidence boost that she got after 6 months. And what she's done is gone and grabbed all the shoes from the shoe rack and is finally showing her playful side, being quotes a normal dog. And if we can shuttle on, I think we'll shuttle on all right. That was a setback. I had a terrible fall, broken elbow, just as we were getting somewhere with her. And she could tell that things weren't wrong in the household. There was a lot of tension because I didn't get very good treatment and wasn't well. And I think she just read the mood and everything slowed down again. But eventually, and I think the last photo in this sequence will show. Yeah, eventually, it was the February of last year. In other words, it was 14 months after we got her that we eventually got her out for a walk, and it was such a huge moment. And she began to show doggy curiosity, especially if there's a cat around. But she's still, to this day, a pretty nervous dog. Just before I came on air, as it were, somebody came to the door to pick up a parcel that I'd kept, and she went absolutely haywire, whining and barking, and this is her safe space, and nobody's out in it. But she is a lovely dog.
Oh, these are such lovely, heartwarming stories, but also a bit of recognition of what you take on, right? When you take on a rescue dog, because you don't necessarily know their history or their background. So, Rory, what advice would you give to someone considering adopting a rescue dog?
Well, advice I didn't take myself. In other words, do your research. I mean, we wouldn't be without her now, obviously, but when I think back, we were pretty foolish. We were impatient too. We had got our first dog from Dogs Trust, which is a great organization. And we went back there, but it just seemed really difficult. It seemed that there were a lot of staffies, which we didn't want. There were a lot of restrictions on various dogs. This dog doesn't like children. This dog doesn't like men. And we were impatient. I'll accept that. And we began to get a bit frustrated. And then we met somebody, a an old colleague of mine in the street, and she had a nice little terrier with an injured leg, which was hopping along. And I said, "Oh, where'd that dog come from?" And she said Romania, and she put us in touch with this organization. It's great people, a Romanian couple that have lived over in this country for nearly 20 years and are passionate about dogs. But they were perhaps, whereas Dogs Trust was too cautious, they were perhaps too optimistic.
Right.
When we picked out Sophie from a list of photos, it said something like, Sophie loves everybody. She's just looking for her forever home. And,
very appealing.
Yes. Yeah. And so we weren't ready for what we were taking on. And if you are the kind of person that is, as we've learned to be, that is patient and doesn't expect too much of the dog, fine. But a lot of people aren't like that. And then you get awful situations where people hand back the dogs or dump them. So you don't want to be in that situation, and you don't want to be in a situation where you're doing damage to the household because everyone's focused on the dog and nothing else. But what I would say is it's unless you're an incredibly confident person, you need to see the dog before you buy, as it were.
Yeah, absolutely. And sort of moving the conversation on just a little bit, Rory, but how, you talk very candidly about your Parkinson's diagnosis. And I wondered whether or not you have any reflections on how perhaps Sophie's helped you cope with your diagnosis.
Yeah, well, I was diagnosed in 2019, so 6 years ago now. So I was kind of 3 years in, nearly 4 years in, to be honest, when she arrived. And in some ways she didn't help me, because one of the whole points of having a dog was to get out at 7 o'clock in the morning, which I now do, thank goodness. Begin the day on a sort of positive note, start closing the circles on my smartwatch, which, my targets for the day. But on the other hand, she gave me something else to worry about rather than my Parkinson. And she has been incredibly absorbing and interesting, and there's a lot of love in her. So it's been a good focus for me. At a time when my Parkinson's, having gone through a honeymoon period, has taken a bit of a step down. I'm less mobile than I used to be. I've just come back from a fantastic weekend in Venice with my wife, celebrating our wedding anniversary, and what was slightly sobering was that the first time partly because of Sophie, the first time I'd been abroad in 18 months through an airport, and I was really struck by how long it took me to get through security and all that. My wife's patient, but she's a very efficient person. It was going, hold on. Yeah.
That's a really great segue. Thank you so much, Rory, to just talk a little bit about your Parkinson's diagnosis. And can you describe how you first discovered that you had Parkinson's, and what has that journey been like for you?
Well, I used to do a little bit of running with our previous dog. I ran in several half marathons, the Ealing half marathon. I think I did it 5 times. And then I began to slow down, and I used to see a physiotherapist for various running injuries I got. And I went to see him when we got back from a holiday in the summer of 2018. We'd been in Italy, and Diane, my wife, just had noticed, and we both noticed, that I was dragging my right foot. It was really strange. She said, pick your feet up, and then she began to worry. And the physio, who's a great guy, I think he knew something, because he said, this is a bit beyond me, this. I think you ought to see your GP. And I did go and see my GP, and then got referred to neurologists with another 4-month wait for that, which it turns out is not unusual. In fact, is quite good. So shocking is the level of provision for people with Parkinson's. Anyway, in the meantime, somebody had written to the BBC suggesting I see a neurologist. I'd been on breakfast television from the Channel Islands, from Jersey, where they've got great broadband connection down a fiber optic cable, and I was standing on the beach holding this cable, and this person had noticed my tremor, which I hadn't noticed at that stage,
Right.
And wrote into the BBC saying that gentleman should see somebody about that, because that could be a sign of Parkinson's disease. So by the time the following January, beginning of January, that I went to St Mary's Paddington for my neurology appointment, I was not at all surprised that the diagnosis would be Parkinson's, or it was a slightly junior doctor, and she was fine, but she didn't really have the gift of the gab. She said, "Oh, evidence of Parkinsonism," which is sort of a technical term, and I had to sort of do two double takes. Oh, I've got Parkinson's. It's incurable. It's degenerative. That's not great. And I know a lot of people, it's kind of a devastating moment. I have to say, for me, it wasn't so much, because I had another long-term condition that I'd been diagnosed with in 2004, 2005, which was much more frightening, I found, which was a malignant melanoma behind this eye, which felt like a huge emergency. It was cancer. It's your eye, which feels a very vulnerable thing.
Yeah.
And that was terrifying. And Parkinson's, by contrast, just seemed to me, oh, here's another damn thing. But, get on with it. My dad had Parkinson's at a very advanced age. He was in his late 80s by then. And in fact, he died 6 months after I was diagnosed. But not before he'd sort of written me this really touching letter about Parkinson's, give me some advice about it.
And how would you say, Rory, that it affects your daily life and your work as well?
Well, I would have said until recently, hardly at all. I mean, in terms of daily life, though, everything has slowed down, as I described. I mean, just getting your socks on in the morning, getting ready to go out. I don't sleep well at all, so that's one major effect.
Right.
I woke up at 3 a.m. today. In terms of work, well, I kept on working at the BBC, and in fact, I didn't leave the BBC because of Parkinson's. I left the BBC in late 2021 because they moved my job to Glasgow, which was never going to work. And I don't think it had really affected me that much then. My typing has always been terrible. It's got a lot worse. And lately, there are sort of periods in mid-morning where I find I can't do it at all. I'm having a low. I need to take a tablet, and it improves. So I tell you, one of the problems with it is distinguishing between things that are symptoms of Parkinson's and things which are just, old age, frankly.
Right.
But, remembering stuff, getting stuff done. I was comparing notes with a friend the other day who works on the podcast that I do, Mark Mardell, and we both agreed it just took us writing a piece, because we both still write, just took so much longer.
Yeah.
Not just physically, but the sort of mental process and the focus of doing so.
And Rory, obviously a diagnosis like that is a deeply personal issue. How did you experience other people's reactions to your diagnosis?
That's an interesting question. I think this is common to a lot of illnesses, which is that you almost feel guilty telling people because you're worried. You end up comforting them. You know what I mean? They just go, "Oh no, that's terrible." And you go, oh, it's not great, but it's not that bad.
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember people sort of looking stricken and not knowing what to say. So I was quite. That made me quite eager to get the news out fairly swiftly, actually.
Yeah. And bringing it back to Sophie and the joy that she brings to your life, what role does she play in terms of your support network alongside your family and friends? So, what's that support like for you?
Well, she's my emotional support dog, and I'm hers in some ways. It's a much simpler relationship than with a human carer, because she's sensitive, as I said earlier, to mood, I think, and I think my nerve. I get nervy when things are going wrong with her, and my wife tells me you need to calm down because the dog can actually sense that.
Yeah.
But she's very patient. We now, having had 2 escapes, actually 3, we've had a very recent escape, have got her in a very secure harness, which has got a lot of buckles to do up. And you can just imagine me doing these buckles up is quite a business. But she's very patient about that. She doesn't complain. So that's great.
Oh, that's fantastic. And it's interesting how much animals can actually contribute to our well-being, in lots of different ways. So moving on to another topic. So you've been a busy person, and I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the Movers and Shakers podcast. So tell us a little bit about your podcast, Movers and Shakers, and what motivated you to start it.
Well, this was interesting. The people you meet through Parkinson's. I was thinking the other day, I got to go to Buckingham Palace because of Parkinson's and meet other Parkinson's people there. But what happened is 3 or 4 years ago, I got a phone call from a BBC colleague, Edward Sturton, a very distinguished chap who I didn't really know, but was slightly in awe of. And he knew I'd got Parkinson's, and he said his great friend from childhood had just been diagnosed and was in a really bad state, and could I have a chat to him? So I said yes, and I went to the pub, and this great friend turned out to be the most confident, together sort of person you could possibly think of. A High Court judge, Sir Nicholas Mostyn, once Britain's highest paid divorce barrister, acted for Paul McCartney. And we got on, and on about the second or third meeting we had, he said, "Do you mind if I bring Jeremy Paxman along?" So I said, "Oh, fine." And then we ended up with half a dozen of us meeting in this same pub in Notting Hill from time to time, in what the judge referred to as our sort of emotional support bubble. And it was him. Well, first of all, he suggested that we wrote a book. And Jeremy and others told him that was the worst idea ever. And then he said, "Well, what about a podcast?" And I knew a bit about podcasting. In fact, I was having talks with somebody else about doing a much more straightforward Parkinson's podcast. So I got involved in discussions with him. And in March 2 years ago, March 2023, we started. We had a go. We found a great young producer, sort of a one-man podcasting company, and we sat in this very cramped space at the back of the Ladbroke Arms in Notting Hill, around a table, and we just talked. And either we were on good form that day, or more likely the producer did a great editing job, but it seemed to work. And we've just carried on from there. We thought we might do 10 and then stop, and now we've done about 70 and are still going. And
Wow.
we've done it's always complicated getting everybody together, so we record several to go, but we've done just every topic you can possibly imagine, and more. And for me, it's been an incredibly interesting educational experience, because I had to learn about things like genetics, and how clinical trials work, and the importance of exercise and nutrition. We hear all this great advice, and I'm afraid I don't take enough of it. But we get all these experts on talking about the best ways of living with Parkinson's,
Sure.
and there's a bit of light and a bit of shade, and people seem to really appreciate it. We get the most wonderful emails from people saying, thank goodness somebody's talking about this, because we all feel forgotten.
And what are some of the most memorable episodes or guests that you've actually had on the podcast, Rory?
Well, we've had a mixture of incredibly eminent scientists. There's a guy called Roger Barker at Cambridge who's been working for 35 years on kind of gene therapy, and has great triumphs and then great disappointments, and is quite hopeful again at the moment. And he was fascinating. But I think it's individual people's stories. Terrible story of people, this is quite topical, of a woman who in her 50s, so what was still relatively young for Parkinson, trying to get PIP, the benefit, and finding how dreadfully difficult it was, and how the assessor said, well, and something like, well, I can see you're not fit for work at the moment, but in 6 months' time, you might be better. Not quite getting the fact that that's not the way Parkinson's goes. So stories like that, and we had a remarkable demo. I being a techie, have done several episodes about technology, and there's a man called Carl Beach who's got young onset Parkinson's disease, who's invented this gadget which seems to help him speak better. Like lots of people, his speech is really affected. And there is this idea called cueing, which is that if you set up a regular rhythm, it can help people walk or speak better. And he demonstrated this live on our podcast. He had stopped his medication for a few hours beforehand, and he was barely comprehensible. And then immediately he turned this device on, he became much clearer, and it was incredibly graphic demonstration. And of course, people will say maybe it's the placebo effect, but he's a brilliant guy, and it's a really interesting gadget.
And thank you. That's really interesting. And how do you think the podcast helps raise awareness around Parkinson's and its impact? So we talked a little bit about the variety of the topics that you cover. Do you think that helps folk?
Well, we've somehow found ourselves, and different people have had different attitudes to this, taking on a campaigning role. Gillian Lacey Solomon, who's the one woman on it, we're rather badly represented. He's an incredibly enthusiastic and creative person, and she sort of goaded us into coming up with something called the Parky Charter, which is a sort of manifesto for better treatment. Because as we learned a lot more about Parkinson's, we realized that the standard of care that most people get is just not good enough. I mean, the main thing that really stands out is how long it takes to see a neurologist and get a diagnosis confirmed, and then once you're in the system, how often you see that neurologist. And then the really shocking thing is that people were being told that they'd have to wait more than a year, and of course people were inevitably going private, because why wouldn't you? go private and then get in the system, and at least you've then got certainty. And we just said that's not good enough. So and there is a shortage in neurologists, and so that's the number one demand in our charter. And other things like the doctors generally are good at prescribing the drugs, and the drugs are very important. But it's a multifaceted disease. Everyone's symptoms are different, and what everyone seems to agree is that exercise and diet are two really important things.
Yeah.
Yet your doctor is quite likely not to mention them to you.
Yeah.
And certainly not point you towards, well, there's this exercise class or this physiotherapist or this nutritional advisor. So we want there to be more holistic care. And we want sort of rights for people, to have better advice on benefits and so on.
Yeah. And so we've talked a bit about some of the issues that you want folk to consider in the manifesto, but what do you think are the most critical issues that need more attention in Parkinson's research and in advocacy as well?
Well, research is something I take a great interest in. I'm a patron of Cure Parkinson's, which is a wonderful charity set up just 20 years ago by a man called Tom Isaacs, who had young onset Parkinson's, and its only aim is to abolish itself, is to make itself redundant.
Yeah.
And what's difficult as someone with this condition is how patient you have to be, because a cure always seems 5 years away. That's the old joke. And clinical trials seem to take an extraordinary amount of time. So there was a drug called exenatide, which was an existing diabetes drug, and there were great hopes for this drug. And it had gone into phase 3 trials, which is the final phase before you can get approved. And there was a lot of hope for it, and then it failed. And suddenly, people weren't talking about that anymore.
Right.
And I looked at how long that process had taken, and the trials had begun in 2008. So 16 years to get nowhere. And that's really frustrating. And interestingly, deep in the political news from yesterday, I saw that the government had set a target to decrease the amount of time clinical trials take, and also, and this is a thing I'm really passionate about, to have a health data strategy, so that there was much better sharing of health data with researchers. I'm convinced that there's far too many scare stories about health data that, obviously we should be concerned about privacy, but there's a balance here. And on one side, there is your privacy concerns, and on the other side, there is the hunt for a cure for diseases like Parkinson's. And all the weight seems to be put on the privacy side. And I kind of think, what's the worst thing that could happen to me, if my health data was shared? And obviously it's up to each individual person to worry about that. But I think the worst thing that could happen to me if my health data isn't shared is that, frankly, they don't make any progress on finding ways through this terrible disease.
Well, and we will put the Parky Charter link into the comments today, so people can find out a bit more about it and actually find out how they can actually sign up and get involved. And, we've talked a lot about research, we've talked about advocacy, and we've talked about some of the critical issues for people to consider and to learn more about. But also, you folk like to have a bit of fun. And so I understand that you've also been involved in something called the Big Sing. So I'd love it if you could tell us a little bit more about that and how that actually ties in to the wider advocacy work, Rory.
Well, no, this is really interesting. Again, it was Gillian Lacey Solomon's idea. This originally, when we were thinking up the Parky Charter, she came up with an anthem. Gillian, like lots of us, wakes up in the middle of the night, and what she does, instead of twiddling her thumbs, is write poetry or song lyrics. And she rewrote Gloria Gaynor's "I Will Survive." It became "We Will Survive," and amazingly, we ended up recording a pop video, filmed by some old BBC staff, but also, some great talent, great assembly of talent. A brilliant music producer who's got Parkinson's. Lots of people who didn't have Parkinson's, but were eager to help. And that went up on YouTube last September. And this World Parkinson's Day, which is Friday, we are gathering opposite the Houses of Parliament in Old Palace Yard, with, we hope, quite a few people who will be led in singing "We Will Survive." Now, it could be an unutterable shambles, but it also could be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
We've had a bit of a go. We did a live show at the Middle Temple, and it was an unutterable shambles, singing wise. But
you still had fun.
We still had fun, and we're bringing the issue to public attention. I should say we've also got one of those parliamentary petitions running. We had a sort of our own one, but we've got an official petition running. I think we'll be able to provide the link, and we've got over 20,000 signatures on that. Wow. Aiming for 100,000, which is a huge ask. But if everybody shares it with all their friends, you never know.
Absolutely. So how can people get involved? So we talked about, the different things that you're involved in. So how can others get involved and support the Parky Charter, but also the other Parkinson's campaigns that we've touched on?
Well, I think the main thing is to sign the petition. Listen to the podcast. We've got a website which tells you a lot about the podcast and about the issues we're campaigning on. It's got the incredibly unwieldy address, moversandshakerspodcast.com. And there's information there about the Big Sing, about the petition, and about the Parky Charter, but also information. We're building up a library here because for every episode we provide some background material, and we have covered so much ground over the 70 episodes. And don't forget, the great thing about a podcast is it's up there for the duration, so you can scroll through and see any number of subjects covered. And have a listen. And I also write slightly independently of that, or a lot of crossover, what's called a Substack about health and technology and what I'm seeing happening in that field. And I when the podcast is on air, I write a piece each Saturday about it.
Yeah. You are a very, very busy person. So we're just wrapping up now, Rory. Actually, it's been an absolute joy to speak with you today, and I feel quite inspired, and hopefully our viewers feel quite inspired by your, resilience and the way that you are tackling your diagnosis, but also doing as much as you can to inform, educate, and campaign for others as well. So what are your hopes for the future, both personally and in terms of that advocacy work, Rory?
Well, my hopes are that Sophie the dog gets a bit more confident. My hopes personally in relation to Parkinson's is that there's a slightly faster move towards better treatment. There are things happening. There's deep brain stimulation, which has been around for a while, which involves having electrodes put in one's brain. That is getting better. There's a whole new form of it, which sort of reactive DBS, whereby it sort of adjusts itself rather than you having to go to the hospital to have it adjusted. So there's that. There are new drug pumps. But what everyone's waiting for is something that hasn't been for 60 years, a drug that doesn't just deal with the symptoms, but actually starts tackling the damage going on in the brain, what's called a disease-modifying drug, a drug that slows, stops, or reverses Parkinson's. So that is a big hope. And I think it's just important that we keep up pressure on the medics, on the scientists, and of course on the politicians to do better, because we need to do better. This is a growing population of people who have been kind of forgotten for too long.
I think that's a very poignant point for us to wrap up our conversation. And just thank you so much. And for our viewers, Rory mentioned that it was World Parkinson's Day on the 11th of April. And we're also collaborating with Parkinson's UK. And we are undefeatable to host a day of Parkinson's friendly exercise sessions at the Virtual Village Hall, where we'll have qualified instructors and we'll be hosting Parkinson's specific classes, because as Rory said, exercise is important. And that'll be things from Parkinson's beats drumming to gentle chair yoga and relaxation. And we really hope that you'll be able to join us for that. And obviously, as always, if you can't join us in live, you'll be able to find the whole day's session on YouTube archives afterwards. And as a bit of a wrap up with Rory today, there'll be some links in the chat to the things that we've spoken about today. The link to Rory's books, Sophie, but also the book that you talked about, which we didn't really cover in this session, did we? About your reflections and your story about your mum. And it'd be lovely to maybe get you back to be able to talk about that again. And maybe you could just remind people about the name of that, and we can pop the link into the comments.
That book is called Ruskin Park.
Ruskin Park.
Sylvia, Me and the BBC. And very brief story. My mum was an extraordinary woman who joined the BBC during the war as a married woman, liked the BBC so much that she left her husband, who didn't like the BBC, came to London with a child, my half-brother, joined the BBC TV drama department in the 1950s, incredibly exciting time, had an affair with a man 16 years her junior, which resulted in me and brought me up alone. And when she died, she'd kept every letter she'd ever written, it seemed, copies thereof, and every letter that she'd received. And at the heart of them was the story of the affair, which resulted in me.
Wow. Well, I'm sure we'll get a link into our comments for that book as well. But it's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you today, Rory. And it's been lovely to hear about Movers and Shakers, the Parky Charter, and of course, your wonderful relationship with Sophie, the Romanian rescue. And obviously, you've written a book about that as well, which I hope will bring a lot of joy to folk. And so just thank you from me and from all of us here at the Virtual Village Hall. And good luck singing at the Big Sing on Friday. And I hope you have a lot of fun with that. And thank you for being so candid today and sharing your life and your experiences with us.
Thank you. And only disappointment is that Sophie's skulking downstairs and didn't come and say hello.
Maybe next time, Rory. Okay, well, that's it from us today. So thank you so much for joining us and this conversation with Rory Cellan-Jones, and I'll see you all again very soon. Thanks so much, Rory. All the best.
Cheerio.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye now.